Part of the job search process is making sure that you do your research. Also, you want to prepare, network, and then be intentional when you go to apply for positions. Part of job preparation, most people understand that they have to have a resume. They may fill out tons of applications. They may actually think about what they would wear to an interview. But when it comes to actually preparing for the interview, it's a little harder to understand what exactly are ways to prepare. So today we will be talking about acing the interview, and I will go over tips and strategies to help you prepare for that important interview. So the purpose of the interview is to really showcase to an employer why you would be an asset to their company, how you will enhance that role and fulfill the skills and abilities that they are looking for. They already know you have basic education, abilities, and skill sets needed for the position. Otherwise, you would not have qualified to get to this important step. But an interview is a way for you to let your personality infused with your qualifications really shine through to make sure that they see that you're the best candidate for the position. So consider that most interviewers make their decision on whether you are top candidate or not within the first 15 minutes. The perception that you give to them during those first few minutes is very critical. You want to make a lasting positive impression. Confidence and being decisive, providing great examples, and being able to really verbalize your skill set is important. So let's talk about the interview process. The first step is before. There are definitely considerations that you need to think before the actual interview. The next step is during the interview. There are ways that you can make sure that during the interview, you actually sound confident, you actually showcasing your abilities, and answering questions on point. The third step of the process is afterwards. Many people forget about this important step, but you want to follow up with the employer and make sure that you thank the people who interviewed you for their time. And we'll discuss ways that you can do that. So let's look at step one, before the interview. So we talked about the job search process being important to research. So you want to definitely research the company, understand the position, the department, perhaps the team that that position falls under. You want to try to anticipate questions that they may ask you. Try to look at the dynamics and figure out what would be important to bring to this role. You also want to know more about the company, some of the challenges or the strengths. Have they been recognized recently in the community? Therefore, you can better prepare questions during the interview that you can ask. Then there's the practice, the interviewing itself. Many times we don't realize when we're nervous that maybe we move our hands around a lot or other distracting behaviors. Perhaps we speed up the way that we talk, and it makes it difficult for someone to understand us. So making sure that you practice answering questions when you're really nervous will really help during those times. You also should think ahead about your attire. You might need to go and pick up a pantsuit or a dress, or you may look at your shoes and think about your grooming. How would you wear your hair? Those are all really important when it comes to their perception of you. You also want to know the location of the interview. If it's someplace you've never been, you may want to do a practice run to see, are there traffic considerations? Does it take longer than anticipated? Because there's nothing worse than arriving late for an interview. And then, of course, you want to arrive early. So making sure that when you are scheduled for an interview, that you have enough time blocked out in your schedule to make sure that you can arrive early. And then if time runs over, you're not a rush to try to leave the interview. Your image is very important when it comes to making a lasting positive impression. Not just what you look like, but also how you say something are important. Studies have shown that 65% of the conveyed message is nonverbal. So, what does that mean? Your nonverbals are your facial expressions, your hand gestures, your physical appearance, the inflection of your tone, also the language that you use. Does it have an inflection on the end? Are you speaking in a quiet tone or are you speaking very loud and dramatic? Those all convey different messages. So they can influence your ability to get across your message to an employer. What you wear will depend on the culture of the company. But as we start to talk about appropriate interview attire, keep in mind it's always better to be overdressed and make sure that you look professional than it is to be underdressed. So let's talk about interview attire. Most interviews are business professional attire. Now, there's some that you may have interviewed in the past for entry level retail positions where they interview you on the spot, whether you're in jeans and a t-shirt. But if it is a scheduled interview, particularly when it comes to your career, you should always err on wearing business professional. So, what business professional means as opposed to business casual, we're going to talk about that. So, for men, you want to think about a suit. A suit is different than just any old jacket and pants together. A suit is actually bought together because it's cut from the same cloth. So it has the same style, material, and feel and look to it. You also want to think about a button up shirt, something that has a collar that you definitely need to iron, and it looks really crisp and sharp. You want to be conservative in colors. You don't want to wear anything really loud and flashy, even though that's your personality. You want to think about the people that you will be interviewing. What's their generation? What would their consider to be appropriate? So, in order to be on the safer side, it's always better to think navy blue, black, possibly gray. So, kind of neutral colors. When it comes to ties, there's all sorts of different designs, and people tend to wear ties in all different kind of ways. Again, it's always better to be more on the conservative side. It's okay to show a little bit of color. I'm not suggesting you wear a black suit with a black tie, but again, you don't want to wear anything that stands out too much so that it distracts the employer and that's all they can focus on. For women, it's okay to wear a multitude of different business professional attire. You have a little bit more options when it comes to what is appropriate. You can certainly wear a two-piece suit with the jacket and pants, but you can also wear a two-piece suit that includes a jacket and a skirt. Or perhaps you have a nice dress and you pair that with a jacket. So you have a lot of different options. Just make sure whatever shirt that you wear underneath is also crisp and ironed, but the neckline is conservative, where it's not dipping too low to show cleavage. So here are examples of what is better safe than sorry. So as you can notice from the men in the pictures, their tie has a little pop of color, but nothing too crazy. And their shirt is conservative, so it offsets the color of their tie. But this is what I meant by a suit. The jacket and the pants match and have the same design and color. For the ladies, as I mentioned, you can do a skirt with the jacket, but notice in the other picture with the lady in the gray dress, she simply has a gray sheath dress with a jacket. When you wear heels, you want to make sure that the heels are not too high, and it's not necessary to wear heels. It's perfectly acceptable to wear a closed-toe flat shoe. So let's talk about business casual. In some instances, it's more appropriate to wear business casual. Perhaps it's a career fair or a networking event or some banquet or function at a conference that you attend. If business casual is what is accepted, then here's the difference between that and business professional. For men, when we talked about for business professional wearing a two-piece suit, as a business casual, it doesn't necessarily have to be a suit. You can wear a jacket and a different set of pants. They don't have to be the same color or necessarily from bought together as the same fabric. Notice in the picture, there is a black jacket with kind of khaki tan pants. Also, it's not necessary to wear a tie. So again, in this example, you see that he has a button-up shirt as well as a collar, but no tie. So for business casual, if you have a jacket, not wearing a tie makes it more casual. Also acceptable are sweaters and vests. So instead of the jacket, if he had a nice sweater or if he had a nice vest or sweater vest, then that would be acceptable as well. For women, it's the same. Instead of wearing the jacket, if they wore a sweater, then that also would be acceptable. And again, notice that it's two different colors. It's not necessarily the same on the top as on the bottom. So here's an example for you to think through on how would you best prepare for an interview. So Herman is applying for a job as a second grade teacher in a public elementary school. Having done his research, he knows that the position is open because a teacher recently quit the position mid-year. The school is K through 8, has over 500 students, and is located in an economically disadvantaged area. So how would you help Herman ace the interview? How should he prepare, first of all? Well, one, because it's in an economically disadvantaged area, he may want to be familiar where the school is located. Maybe it's really located far out in a rural area, and directions may not be as clear following a GPS. How else should he prepare? Perhaps understanding the challenges the school face. Possibly, is there a reason that the teacher left? Maybe look at test scores to see how he might be able to shine. Those are all different ways that Herman could prepare before the interview. Now, what questions should he anticipate that they would ask him? Certainly about his experience in teaching. And because it's a second year public elementary school, there may be other responsibilities that as a teacher he would be responsible for. So they may ask him about that. What other questions do you think they may ask him? Certainly, has he worked with economically disadvantaged families? Are there special considerations or techniques or teaching strategies that he would use in that situation? And lastly, what questions should Herman ask the employer? Definitely, he should ask about other responsibilities. What are some of the challenges? Are there other activities that the teacher would be responsible for in that position? All great questions that he should ask the employer and would be appropriate. So now let's talk about the different types of interviews, because that will really help you prepare, knowing up front what's the format, what kind of questions could they possibly ask, and what kind of interview it actually is. So a screening interview, that is typically used as a way to filter prospective employees, up front. Sometimes it's used as a first interview, and then they narrow down the candidate pool to select the ones they want to have a second interview. But a screening interview, you can tell by the questions that they ask. Typically, it's only a few questions. They're very basic and general. And again, this is really to kind of give a pre-qualification if they want to have a more in-depth understanding and interview with the candidate. Another type of interview is over the telephone. And the reason this is something to prepare for, because it's a lot different when you're sitting face to face with someone than when you have to answer questions over the telephone. Now, some telephone interviews are also screening interviews. They ask a few basic questions over the telephone to determine if they'd like to actually bring you for an in-person interview. The third type of interview is a teleconference or video interview. Sometimes this can be daunting simply because there could be a lot of people in the room. You can have technical difficulties. And with the video interview, you only have a very short amount of time to record your answer to a question before it cuts off. So you may not get everything out correctly or the way that you want to actually articulate it, or you might just go blank and end up not having enough time. So it can be very challenging. But a teleconference or video interview can be through a system where it records your answers ahead of time, or it can be an in-person video using such methods as Zoom, Skype, WebEx, or some other video platform. Now that we've talked about the types of interviews, let's talk about the format of interviews. So, one-on-one interviews are pretty self-explanatory. That's where you as the candidate interview with one company representative. So, it's one-on-one. A serial interview is where they're one-on-one interviews, but it's with more than one company representative. So typically you may have an interview with one person, and then when that concludes, you may be directed to go to another office and interview with another person. A panel interview is a little less common. Is becoming more and more common. And that's usually when you as the candidate interview with a group of interviewers. So more than one person, usually between 3 or 4, but I've seen some interviewers have up to 10 people in the room. That is really intimidating and can really make someone anxious and nervous. So that you definitely want to prepare for. And then less common are group interviews. This is where you as a candidate are joined by other candidates. And so the interviewers are asking you as a group certain questions, and each of you would be able to give your answer. But you're all in the same room together. So now that we've talked about before the interview, the second step is during the interview. So during the interview, there are certain considerations that you need to really make sure that you think about and follow through. The first is to turn your cell phone off and, if possible, put it away. Don't even let that be a distraction if it buzzes or beeps. You also want to consider what's in your mouth as far as gum, candy, mints, or anything of that nature, because you don't want it to cause you to stumble over your words or for you to accidentally swallow it and choke. And if you drink water, sometimes it can be a distraction because you use that as a crutch because you're nervous. You definitely want to take a deep breath. Check your nerves at the door. You want to come off confident. You also want to come into the room and begin every interview with a handshake. Shaking hands is definitely makes a great first impression, and making sure that you shake everyone's hand in the room. And smile. A lot of times a smile goes a long way in breaking the tension and checking your nerves. When you sit down, make sure that you sit up straight, you look confident, you're not slumped over, that you really pay attention to your posture and how you hold your hands. Make sure that when you're answering the questions, you stay on target, making sure that you give great examples that relate your skills, knowledge, and abilities to whatever the question is. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Figure out how to conclude your statement. There's nothing worse than when a candidate is answering a question and just keeps rambling on and on and on. So you definitely want to make sure that you practice being concise and how to wrap up your answer. During the interview, you also want to have a short closing statement, almost the opposite of almost similar to an elevator speech. You want to have one as a closing, just kind of a summary of who you are. And hey, it might have been 20 minutes ago that they asked the first question. So it's a great way to kind of end the interview. You definitely want to express not just your interest in the position, but your enthusiasm and excitement to get started. A lot of times employers look for that. And as a candidate, it may be hard. Well, how do I demonstrate that? So definitely we want to think about how you answer your questions, which we'll talk about next. And then lastly, you want to ask questions. I know many times we're nervous and we're just ready to go, but it really demonstrates to them that you've done your research, that you're definitely interested specifically in that position in that company, and you have questions. So you're invested in learning more. Make sure that you have questions prepared. You can have them written out. You don't have to memorize them. And when you come into an interview, you really should have a folder or a portfolio with a notepad. And right on that notepad, you can have questions already written out. So now let's talk about the types of questions that you may be asked during an interview. There are situational or performance interviews. This is when you are given a scenario and asked how you would handle it. Sometimes you actually have to perform. You may be given a situation and you may have to create a presentation and actually give that presentation during the interview. Or you may be given a scenario and you may actually have to play out that scenario, sort of like role playing. This gives the employer a more picture of how you would handle different situations that they encounter in that job. A behavioral interview are when you're asked questions, asking for examples really to provide for past behavior. This is to help employers be able to predict how you will handle certain situations that they know come across in their company. And then lastly are technical interviews. This is when you're actually asked for a technical or job specific skill. So it could be a typing test, it could be an actual quiz or exam over certain technical skills, or it could simply be, making sure that you understand terms. So any of these types of questions could be asked during an interview. And which kind of questions they may ask, that's really going to determine how you prepare. So there are certain questions that are pretty common. And when I have done mock interviews with students, I have found that there are certain ones that are just difficult for everyone to answer. So it's very important that you prepare for these common questions because you don't want to be caught off guard. The most first common question is, tell me about yourself. This is a typical first question because it's a great icebreaker and it's a great way to kind of get right up front a short introduction of yourself. But why is this so difficult to answer? Because we don't like to talk about ourselves. But remember, this is an interview and you have to market yourself. A lot of reasons that this is hard to answer is because you really don't know what they mean. Where do you start? Well, you want to make a short, organized statement and you want to stick to your professional achievements or perhaps your education or even your professional goals. So you don't want to necessarily start about how in grade school you used to deliver newspapers, but you want to specifically think about the position you're applying for and the role really that you want to play in that position and how you perhaps got to the point of being interested. Another common question is, why do you want to work here? Why do you want to work for Google? Why Disney? Right? And why is that so tricky for us to answer? Most of the time is because we're applying to a bunch of different jobs. So we don't really have a specific company. We just want to get hired and start gaining experience. But this is where you can really show your research. A company doesn't want to just be one of 1,000 that you're applying to. They want to see that you have an invested interest and really a professional goal in mind because they want to invest time in someone who's going to stick around and actually be an asset to their company and to that position. Other common questions are, what is a major weakness? Or tell me a weakness and a strength. And a weakness inherently is negative. We start to think about, oh, well, I get up late and I'm always late everywhere I go. Or I'm always bad at procrastinating. Or I tend to lose focus. Well, you don't want to tell an employer that. That's a red flag for sure not to hire you. So, how do you answer this question? Well, turn that weakness into a strength. So, for example, you might say, I often worry too much over my work and I want to make sure that I get things really right. So sometimes I have to take extra time or work late because I want to make sure that the job is well done. So notice how it's a weakness, but instead of saying I procrastinate or it takes me forever to get things done, you're kind of highlighting the fact that you try to make sure that the first time that you do it is done correct. And what employer can fault you for that? Also, you may want to mention ways that you've worked on it. So, if you know that procrastination is an issue for you, but you've worked really hard on your time management, it's okay to say, I tend to procrastinate. I always manage to meet the deadline, but it's a lot of stress and worry on my team members. So I've really worked hard on my time management. So now I do X, Y, and Z to make sure that I'm not waiting till the last minute. That's an excellent way to prove a weakness that you have and be really genuine about it. But then ways that you have proactively worked on that, because we all have weaknesses. Another common question is, what salary are you expecting? Now, nowadays, it might not be quite as common, but I still wanted to bring it up because it's very important that you try to avoid talking about salary during the interview. Sometimes it's you as a candidate are wanting to know more information about the salary. That's not really an appropriate time to start asking about that. But sometimes an employer, especially if they're trying to decide between a couple candidates, they're going to look at, well, what is the salary expectation? And bottom line is they want to go with who they can get for the cheapest, right? So you don't want to pigeonhole yourself in cutting yourself too low or expecting too high, and it kind of takes you out of the running. Plus, it kind of takes away your salary negotiation power. If all up front you've already kind of agreed to a certain salary range. So you really want to try to avoid answering directly this question. So you could say anything like, I believe if we both decide I'm good fit for the position, we can agree, I'm sure, on a fair compensation price. That's acceptable. Or you can give them a range. This is where your research comes in again. If you know for that position, the going rate is between 30,000 and 40,000, then instead of giving them a precise salary figure, you can say, well, I know the acceptable range is between 30 and 40,000. I'm sure we can come on a mutual agreement. Again, you're not pigeonholing yourself, but it's within their range. So let's talk about behavioral questions. These are very common. Most of questions that are asked usually are wanting an example. They want you to tell them when you have experienced something that their employees experience. So it could be when you've encountered a problem and how have you handled it. It could be how you've dealt with an angry customer, or maybe how do you multitask or prioritize your work. So these are all different scenarios that they may be asked in several different ways. However, the underlying question you can prepare for. And how is using the STAR method. So when we talk about a behavioral question, we're talking about you providing an example of a time. So you want to think about the situation where you give a brief background story so they understand the context of the example. Now, I want to stress the word brief because this is usually where a student or a candidate goes on and on and on about the backstory. You just want to explain the context, but it takes up a lot of time and you're giving way too much detail. So make sure that it's brief. Second, T, which stands for task or a problem, a challenge, or an issue. So you want to briefly again describe what it was you were dealing with. Was it a broken faucet? Was it a food came out cold? Was it missing the product that the customer was looking for? Again, brief, because what you want to give a lot of time to is A, the action. You want to give them lots of details about what you did to handle the task or problem. And when you go to give the details, think about actionable steps. What are the steps that you took? What was your thought process that led to your action? So instead of just saying, oh, well, I just went and got my supervisor, you want to talk about policies. You want to talk about, in this situation, these are the steps that you take. You want to talk about what you did with the customer. What did you say? What was your demeanor? Because again, that's what they're most interested in, is your steps, your decision-making ability, your ability to communicate effectively. And then the last is the R, which stands for results. All of your examples should have a positive outcome, but sometimes when we are explaining an example, we kind of skip over that part. We kind of give a lot of context, a little bit of action, and then, yeah, the customer left. Well, that doesn't give really the result. You want to go into measurable outcomes. So, was the customer satisfied and was able to give a great review? Or did your coworker not only come to some sort of agreement, but it increased work productivity? So anytime you can give a measurable result that's also positive, that is going to have a greater impact when you cite that example. So let's talk about general interview tips. Know what the question is really asking. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways that you can be asked the same question. But if you understand what they're really asking you, then you can prepare for that ahead of time. So keep your answers relevant to the job and give great examples, keeping your answers positive. You never want to be negative about a former employer or supervisor, and really a work colleague. So again, if you're asked about a disagreement or a conflict that you've had with either a boss or a coworker, you don't want to go on and say, you know what, he was just really a jerk, because you never know who knows each other, and you never want to burn any bridges. And then lastly, just sounding negative, makes the employer think, well, what are they going to say about us? So you always want to be professional and make it positive. If there was a disagreement, say, well, there was a disagreement and we decided to part ways. But you never want to say because they were a jerk. And then also focus on what you can do for them. Remember, they're trying to decide if they want to hire you, but then you're also trying to get a feel for if this is someplace you want to work. So make sure that you ask questions, but focus really on the position and what you bring to the table. So we talked about during the interview, it's important to ask questions. So what's an appropriate question? I'm already nervous. I'm already ready to go. I'm already sweating bullets over here. Well, you can prepare your questions ahead of time, have them written out on your notepad, bring that and open it up when they say, do you have any questions for us? Here are some examples of questions that are appropriate to ask. What are the next steps in the interview process? Or when do you hope to have this position filled or have the person start? Those are appropriate. Also, another great one is, what is the greatest challenge that you're currently facing in your department? Or what's an average day? Or are there other duties that the person would be responsible for or opportunities for growth? All very acceptable questions. Questions that, based on your research and understanding the company and the position, shows that you have an actionable interest, an active interest in that position. So now that we've talked about during the interview, let's talk about after the interview. This is an important step that is often overlooked and missed. How often do you actually go back and send a thank you letter to someone that you interviewed with? Not very often, but it's important to follow up with the employer. This is an opportunity to thank each person in that room for taking the time to meet with you. Sometimes we don't always get our full message across and we think of something really great that we should have said afterwards. So you can also point that out in a thank you letter. You can show your enthusiasm for the role, but there may have been something that you were really prepared to answer that they didn't ask you. So maybe you might also jot that too. What really helps you to stand out is taking notes during the interview. Just jot down who the people were and if there was a specific comment or question that they asked you that you might be able to reference in your thank you letter to them. Whether it's about, oh yeah, your son is interested in this program. I just wanted you to know, here's information to connect them to this opportunity. That makes a great impact because it shows that you were listening, but also now they have a personal connection. So how do you follow up? A lot of times it's easy to send an email or we want to call someone, but the best way to send a follow up is a thank you card, note, or letter. This can be handwritten or you can type it up, but definitely mailing it to someone or dropping it off to their office is going to be way more effective than you think. I know it seems outdated, but sometimes phone calls and emails are easy to overlook or get lost in the millions of phone calls and emails they get a day. If it's a job where they're really out in the field working and they're not sitting at the computer, they may not even hardly check that thing. So if you send a thank you letter, it's hard for them to miss it. Even if they don't have the opportunity right when they first receive it to open it up, it sits on their desk and something that they definitely will go back and open up. But whatever method that you choose to send your follow up, make sure that you do it within 24 hours of the interview. If you wait 2 or 3 weeks, it may seem a moot point if they've already decided on another candidate. Also, make sure that you reiterate your interest in the job as well as the position with the company. So now that we've talked about the follow up during the interview and before, here are some common mistakes in your preparation that you want to think about so hopefully you can avoid. Sometimes the problem are with your answers. Maybe they're too short. Maybe they don't really answer the actual question. Maybe there's too long and you just ramble on. Either way, you can give the misperception that you're not prepared and that you really didn't listen or you're just being super negative. So you want to make sure that you practice your answers so that you are able to articulate focused, confident, and concise. Other problems could be with your preparedness. Remember I mentioned knowing where the interview is located because it's such a bad impression when you arrive late. Sometimes arriving late, they understand and might proceed with the interview, but in the back of their head, they're thinking that you weren't really quite prepared. Sometimes you don't know enough about the company and it's evident. There's nothing worse than sitting in an interview and have the candidate say the wrong name of the company. And then again, if you don't have any questions to ask them, sometimes that also can make you look unprepared. Sometimes the problem is just with your overall presentation, whether you're not addressed appropriately, whether you don't come off as confident, or maybe you have that nervous, anxious laughter. Yeah, that is your overall perception that you're giving to them. And also, if you know that you have issues with talking, maybe talking too low, or you stumble over your words, or you might actually have a speech impediment or issues with pronouncing certain words, just make sure that you take your time so that you can come off clear and concise. Because again, it's nothing worse than being in an interview and not being able to hear or understand the candidate. And then there might be problems with attitude. Now, what do I mean by attitude? Well, many people can pick up and read a candidate. That's kind of why they interview people. So sometimes they can tell when you really don't care about the company, it's just a job to you. Or maybe you're being boastful and overconfident or overselling your skills, or possibly that you don't really have poise or what we call emotional intelligence. Maybe your use of words indicate more of slang instead of being professional. Or maybe you come across very entitled or not even appreciative of the opportunity. So, again, you want to really think about how you come across in an interview And that's why sometimes practicing with another person, basically doing a mock interview, are all going to give you pointers in how you may come across, and your nonverbal, your gestures, your physical um, appearance may come across to someone else. So I want to give you some do's and don'ts. You do want to research the company and dress professionally. You want to know where the interview is and arrive, if you can, 15 minutes early. You want to have confidence, but not be too overconfident. So you want to not only check your nerves, but check your attitude. You want to be courteous and well mannered, basically professional. So you want to give a handshake, firm handshake, and smile. You want to ask questions about the position, and you want to demonstrate your desire and motivation for the job. So here's some don'ts. Make sure that you're not really speaking negatively about previous jobs, supervisors, or even coworkers. And you don't want to overdo accessories, makeup, cologne, or perfume, because that can be a distraction. Remember, no matter what your personal preference is, you're under the scrutiny of kind of that generation and who's in the room interviewing you. You don't want to ask about salary. And remember, you want to creatively try to delay answering if you're asked about salary. You don't want to bring anybody with you because that kind of doesn't give a good impression. This is something that's supposed to be professional. And just like you don't bring someone to sit at your office at your job, you wouldn't do that for an interview. You don't want to answer questions and be really desperate. You want to have a sense of your worth and what you bring to the table. You definitely don't want to falsify information. So if they ask you a question and you literally have never encountered that, it's okay to say, I've not been in that situation. But make sure you do provide how you would handle that situation. Because remember, they don't so much care about the specific example, they care about how you would do in that situation. And then lastly, you don't want to share too much personal information. I've been in several mock interviews with students where they disclose how young they are and actually bring that up as a negative. Any information about age, your gender, your religious affiliation, if you have kids or not, all of those are protected information. If you disclose that during an interview, then you open yourself for them to ask you about it. And unfortunately, that opens the door for discrimination. So just make sure that you don't share too much personal information. So lastly, I just want to make sure that I reiterate that as career development services, we are available to do mock interviews, as well as we do have a hire attire where if you need help with professional clothing, then you can borrow the clothing at no cost and then use it for your interview. But I really want to encourage you to make that investment. We are still meeting with students. Right now, as the campus is closed, we're meeting with students virtually. But even when campus is back open, you can always call our office and we can schedule an appointment. You can make your appointment through Starfish. Or if we are open and on campus, you're more than welcome to stop by the office and we can get you scheduled. So there's a number of different ways that we can make sure that we are assisting you in acing that interview.